Doing a review here for Fatal Delusion, a very little known and obscure slasher film from 1995, directed by Sal Longo. This has been put together and put out by a company called W.A.V.E Productions from the United States, who've done quite a lot of these very sort of low budget or even micro budget films over the past 25-30 years or so. They're still going to this day. And this is one of their earlier slasher efforts. Now it is a DVD-R, I should make that clear. You can see on the spine here that it is in fact a made-on-demand type release, but it does come from this W.A.V.E company, W.A.V.E Productions, like I said, so it is kind of direct from the people that made it, so it is official in that sense, but it didn't actually get a proper release in that it's got like a barcode or an age certificate. That kind of thing is all missing, but it is kind of from the company that made it directly, so it's kind of official if you look at it in that way, but obviously it's more of a made-on-demand type release as opposed to anything more genuine. But that's the back. It's not pretty bare bones, just the one picture from the film at the top there. I think that picture in the bottom corner is more like an advert for the company that helped put it together, perhaps. Very bare bones, not much about the story, it's just kind of more about the actors from the film as opposed to anything else. Go back to the front cover. I'll just mention the disc briefly. This one does actually come with artwork, but a replica there of the front cover, but I believe that it kind of is part like if you buy other films from this site, sometimes they just come with like these very generic sort of discs that you can buy in bulk as opposed to anything with artwork, so it maybe is kind of part luck as to what you get depending on which film you might buy from them. But just something to mention before we get into the story is that it is billed as being Tina Krause's first appearance, as you can see there. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that name correctly. Apologies if I'm not. But for those that might be unfamiliar, Tina Krause has done quite a lot of these sort of very low budget B movies over the years. She's quite well known for them. Mostly sort of like low budget horror films. I myself had only seen it in about 2 films prior to this. I wasn't that familiar with her, but I'd seen it a time or 2, but not in a film this early. And as you can see from that line on the cover there, it is supposed to be her first film appearance. I'm not sure if that's entirely accurate though, because looking at her page on the Instant Movie Database, she does have a few credits prior to this. But that could be because perhaps even though this is kind of said to be a 1995 film, maybe it was actually filmed a few years prior to that, say 92, 93 possibly, so that could explain why there's a bit of a discrepancy there. But anyway, to go into the story for this one, it's basically about this guy called David Keats, or Cates, I forget the exact name, but it's about this guy who's killing women who kind of resemble a figure from his past, his military past. He used to serve in Vietnam. He's been left very traumatized by his experiences there. There was a female figure from his past back in the war that kind of that when he sees anyone that now in the present day that resembles that woman, he kind of sets him off into a murderous rampage, and he tries to kill her. And he kills a couple of these women early on, but then he quickly gets caught by the police, and he kind of he gets incarcerated in a mental institution, and he's there for a few years. But then he kind of gets moved down to a less secure facility. And while he's in this new place, he manages to hatch an escape plan and actually orchestrates this clever plan to escape, and he succeeds in doing so, and he breaks out. And he assumes the identity of his former doctor, his former shrink. And using his new doctor credentials, he kind of goes on a fresh killing spree, and even gets close to the police force that are looking into these new crimes, and uses his new doctor credentials to kind of assist with the investigation on the surface, but really is kind of just using it as a way of finding new victims among the police force. That's basically the premise of it. I'm going to go into what I liked about the film now, the good points for me. And I thought the character of this David Cates, or Keats, was pretty good. I'm normally kind of a stickler for liking masks and disguises for my killer, but in this case that was very absent. It was quite the opposite of that. He's certainly not like a Michael Myers type, he's the exact opposite. But I think this is one of those rare occasions where it actually worked well, and I did actually quite like that, surprisingly. And one thing to mention about the killer, this David Cates, or Keats, is that he actually wore glasses too, which is not something that you see very often for killers in these kind of films. That in itself is kind of worth picking out, and I kind of like that. Kind of had like a bit of a nerdy look to him, which is kind of cool for a change. And the actor that played this character was a lot better than the others, I would say too. The acting, for the most part, being a micro-budget film, as you can guess, isn't very good. In fact, it's pretty terrible at times from some of the minor characters, but for this particular character, the David Cates killer character, was pretty good. You could tell that he's perhaps a bit more experienced than the others, and he did a sterling job, really, so he was good to watch. He was also kind of like a peeping Tom type figure. He would often be seen peering through windows, looking at his victims kind of prior to attacking them, and he was quite comical in the way that he did that. So I liked his character. Next good point that I can pick out is that it's quite a sleazy film. For those that like the nudity in slasher films, you're going to get quite a lot of it here, so you're going to be well catered for. Not least with Tina Krause herself, who actually plays 3 roles in this, 3 different victims, and she looks very attractive. There's 1 or 2 other characters as well that do a good job in the eye candy stake. So if you're into nudity in slasher films, if you consider that to be like a key ingredient, then you're going to be well catered for with this one. And the last good point that I can pick out is that there was a bit more going on with the story than I first thought that there would be. A bit more care and attention had gone into it in terms of crafting the story. It's nothing special, but it's a bit more involved than what I first thought it would be. And it's nice to actually put the backstory in there as well with the Vietnam thing, as to kind of explain why the killer's doing it. So that was a nice touch. On to the bad points now, and the first thing that I can pick out is that it's a bit unrealistic, mostly in how the killer kind of gets off with this kind of plan to pulls off this plan, I should say, to impersonate his doctor once he escapes from the prison or from the mental institution. It doesn't really explain how he does that properly, and it doesn't really make sense because he makes no effort to kind of change his appearance to look like this doctor, and they do look vaguely similar. They both have like a similar haircut and glasses, but apart from that, there's no similarities really. So they don't really explain how he goes about copying the doctor and kind of passing himself off as this guy when he doesn't even have any plastic surgery or anything like that, or even how does he fool the guy's family, that kind of thing. And with him being a serial killer at this point, surely his face would be well known, at least to the police force. So he later goes on to try and help the police in this new role as the doctor, which doesn't really make sense. I'm sure he wouldn't be able to fool them with his face surely being well known at this point. Also, there's a female police officer who kind of gets involved in the story towards the end, and she's a bit unrealistic too in the way that she dresses. It's a bit too sexy really for what a police officer would believably wear. She reminds me kind of like a stripper wearing like a cop's outfit, so that's a bit silly. But it's all part of the fun and charm, I suppose you could argue. The next bad point is that it is a bit long. It's quite long-winded for a slasher film. It goes around about 103, 104 minutes maybe. So it does feel slightly bloated. I think it could have been trimmed down perhaps a little bit. For example, during some of the murder scenes, the killer like chokes his victims out, kind of like chokes them to death. And I think that these bits are a bit too drawn out, and they could have been trimmed down. They go on for a bit too long. And the final bad thing that I can pick out is that this is obviously a micro-budget film. So for those that don't like that, there's going to be a lot here that might kind of bug you. The acting, like I mentioned before, isn't very good for the most part for the fringe characters. It's good for some of the main characters. It's not too bad, considering the budget. But for some of the lesser minor characters, it's really quite terrible. They even seem to forget their lines on certain occasions, so it's very amateurish. And also the sets are very, very bargain basement. You can tell that there's not much money behind the film when you look at some of the sets. They're pretty awful, but like I said, it's all kind of part of the charm really with these low budget films. So I don't mind that myself, but for those that do, it's going to stand out like a sore thumb. And also the picture quality isn't really very good at times, but particularly towards the end it gets very kind of dark and blurry and kind of fuzzy looking. But I can report that on the positive side, the audio quality, which is perhaps more important, is good throughout, so there's no problems there. On the whole though, I did quite like it. It was I thought it was going to be quite bad initially, because for the first 10 minutes or so there's not much dialogue going on. I thought it might be kind of like one of those sort of films a bit like, say, Camp Blood 4 or Meat Up Massacre, where there's not a lot of dialogue, but it didn't turn out to be the case like that. It turns out to be pretty involved with the story as things go on, so a bit more effort had gone into it than I first thought. And I ended up having a decent time with it. So if you do have a tolerance for these very low budget films, it might be worth checking out and worth watching. So yeah, thanks for sticking with the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.